started in Flower Mound for me. I'm sure some of you might have heard a little bit about Flower Mound. I first learned about drilling back in 2004, a lot later than some people from Fort Worth, maybe even possibly in Calvin's area. I would notice, well, a couple times I noticed a rig up driving out West Flower Mound, an area that is pretty rural and a lot of open space. And you know, I didn't even know very much about the Barnett Shale. In fact, I didn't even know what the Barnett Shale was back in 2004. I didn't realize that we lived on the Barnett Shale. I think if I had, I wouldn't be here right now. So, you know, the activity to me at the time seemed very far out. It seemed that I didn't see it next to any homes or schools, so I wasn't too alarmed. But in late 2007, a friend of mine who was also a town council member at the time brought an issue to my attention. She told me that the council, our town council, was about to vote on shortening some of the variance distances from the Welch. So be able to move the drilling closer if a gas company went and, you know, asked for it, giving them a shorter distance so they could get closer. This was one of the recommendations that had come from an oil and gas advisory board that was put together in 2006. Now, the majority of this board at the time was made up of large property and mineral owners, some that didn't even live in Flower Mound but owned large pieces of property, and representatives from the gas and oil industry. There were a couple residents on this board, but they resigned. One woman claimed that she felt intimidated, was even followed to her car a couple times, so she resigned. Their argument for changing this was that they wanted to allow someone who had a big piece of property to drill and get the full benefit of drilling on their property. So in order to change some of these variances so they could get closer to environmentally sensitive areas and homes and their own homes, no big deal. You know, this is what they wanted to do. Well, they also said, you know, I don't know what you're worried about. This is all out there. It's never going to be coming into town. That's not our intention. We just want to be able to drill on our big pieces of land. Well, at the time, not too many people in Flower Mound really knew what was going on. They were kind of unaware of this change. In fact, there was hardly anybody at the meetings. Well, that night, the council voted 4-1 to shorten these distances via variance. And I don't think at the time any of us understood what the ramifications of that change was going to be. Well, shortly after that, a few months later, in 2008, we found out. My husband and I received an offer for our minerals, and the original location was going to be, if they could get it, if they could get us to sign, they were going to want a variance for 300 feet from our home, or 500 feet, if they couldn't get us to sign. Either way, it all became apparent to me why they wanted to shorten, because they were intending on coming in closer to town. And they were intending on coming in closer to many neighborhoods in this area. They did end up moving the location farther away from our home, but they just moved it closer to other homes. I mean, there's thousands of homes in this area and schools. And one of them was my child's school. So my husband and I decided it was time before we signed to research. And that research uncovered a downside to drilling. We realized, first of all, like Deborah said, there was going to be very little money, especially for us, because we weren't big property owners. We didn't own acres and acres of land. We owed maybe a third acre. So there was going to be very little money. But we did know this. We did know that there was going to be increased traffic, noise, emissions, and the excessive use of clean water. We also found out that the gas and oil industry has some exemptions from the EPA's statutes, like the Clean Air and Water Act. And this was very alarming. Now, our old council kept saying how strong our ordinance was. And our ordinance at the time had the reputation of being one of the strongest in the area. But as I sat down and read Flower Mound's ordinance over and over again, from start to finish, I realized that this so-called strong ordinance was really set up to be weakened. And in spite of our very good ordinance, there were gas wells popping up all over. We had sites that had numerous wells, and we even had compressor stations. Now, I realize that those that want to lease their minerals should be able to. But that does not mean that those that do not own their minerals or do not want to sign should be forced to live near industrial sites. Many of us felt that protections needed to be put into our ordinance, better protections for all the residents. In early 2010, 6,000 Flower Mound residents signed a petition asking for a moratorium and an oil and gas advisory board to review the ordinances. The formal council majority rejected the petition and the moratorium, which would force it to go to an election. But in May of 2010, a new council majority was elected, and they immediately accepted the moratorium, accepted the petition, put in a moratorium, and appointed the Oil and Gas Advisory Board. Unfortunately, for the site near my home and many others, it was a little too late for the changes that were about to happen, but still, it was something that needed to be done for all of Flower Mound. I was honored to be selected for the Flower Mound Oil and Gas Advisory Board. The board was made up of many different members. Each of them brought different perspectives and point of views. And our job was to ultimately come up with recommendations for the gas ordinance and the pipeline ordinance. And this meant sharing our information that we each had and discussing ideas. It also meant that as board members, we had to decide as a majority what recommendations were going to go forward. Now, we had mineral owners, we had non-mineral owners. We did have some industry experts who actually were residents of Flower Mound, and we had a moderator. And I can honestly say that not one member got everything they wanted, including me. Although we tried, and some of our discussions were lengthy and long, and we met for 6 months, and we had some very long meetings and some very heated discussions. But, you know, if we hadn't all had different opinions, it wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have been a fair board. So, all in all, it came out okay, and each member brought a certain knowledge and experience and a love for the community, and that was the most important thing. And we looked at many studies and information about property values, insurance issues, state and federal mandates, health issues, noise issues, air, water, and soil contamination. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit. Flower Mound uses a zoning board of appeals process. Our town council does not have an application come in front of them and they vote on it for wells. What we have is we have a board, and if the ordinance does not meet, if the well and the application does not meet the criteria in the ordinance, then they have to request a variance, and it goes in front of our Oil and Gas Board of Appeals. Now, this is a quasi-judicial board that is appointed by the council. Most of them serve for 2 years, and they have a certain criteria that they have to use when deciding whether to approve or deny a request. We did have a decision that was legally challenged in 2008 by Red Oak Gas for denial of 12 requested variances. For one site, the site wanted variances for environmentally sensitive areas, a hospital, a park, and a daycare center. Our Oil and Gas Board of Appeals decision did hold up in the court of law, so it was not overturned. Our advisory board had to keep legal issues in mind as well as the issues concerning all residents. In addition to our meetings, we also had 2 public hearings so that residents come and voice their concerns. Then we broke each issue down into categories and addressed them individually. Some of the issues were setbacks, variances, administrative approvals, centralized facilities and produced water pipelines, emergency plans, insurance, noise, monitoring for air, water, and soil contamination. As far as setbacks, we did have a 1,000-foot setback from homes, churches, schools, but then again, it could be brought down to as close as 300 with variances. What we did was we increased that to 1,500 feet from the edge of disturbance. So that's not from each piece of equipment, that's actually from the pad site. And that was for fresh water wells, new construction, public parks, hospitals, churches, schools, and homes. Then for the floodplain, public road, or right-of-way and property line, we increased them from 500 to 750 feet. But the most important change was these setbacks can only be reduced by 25% of the distance. And that's very important because 71% of the variances requested before the new ordinance was put in were approved. And some of them did bring drilling within 300 to 500 feet of homes and schools and churches, and down to 0 feet from environmentally sensitive areas. So as of today, approximately 70 wells have been drilled and another 14 wells were approved before the moratorium was put into place. Administrative approvals is the next thing we addressed. And since if an application comes in and it meets all the criteria in the ordinance, it can be administratively approved. Now, we've had, I believe, 4 pad sites and 16 wells that fell under that out of the wells that have been drilled. But, you know, this was very frustrating to residents because all of a sudden a well would show up. They didn't know because they didn't have to know. It was administrative approved, and if they didn't sign a lease, they wouldn't have an idea that anything was going to go in there. So, you know, since we have the Zoning Board of Appeals, we can't really change that, but what we did decide to do was there will now be public notice for all property owners within 1,500 feet of a proposed site, and there will be public meetings discussing what's going to go on there. So they will be aware now, and just, you know, trucks won't just show up anymore and start drilling. Emergency plans. We did enhance those a bit. Flower Mound now requires evacuation plans for residents within a half a mile of the site. And operators must use a hazardous material cleanup service company for all leaks and spills. They can't do it themselves. They must conduct an on-site emergency drill every 2 years. And they must have an alarm system for drops in pressure, gas release, or fire. And they must submit a copy of their emergency plan to the school districts and any schools that are near the sites for their for the school's comment and input. Now, next is insurance, and we really increased this quite a bit. It was $1 million per occurrence, but you know, you're in an urban setting, you got thousands of homes, people, children, schools, and we just felt that wasn't enough if there was something that happened. And so we increased that to $25 million. Yeah. So, and then the environmental insurance was increased from $10 million to $75 million. And, you know, it costs a lot to clean up a mess. I mean, look at what happened out in the Gulf. It's not cheap to clean up a mess. So, you know, that's pretty significant. I don't know anybody else or any other ordinances that have really done that yet, but it's a really good idea to protect your residents in case of a spill. And we know they happen. I mean, look what happened out at the Ruggierios. You know, what's it going to cost someday to clean that mess up? And who's going to get stuck with it? Most likely, the city and us, the taxpayers. Air and water issues. Flower Mound will continue monitoring their own air. We do have a 24-hour monitor in an area out in the west area. Don't know how good that is. I mean, you know, it's one, and I mean, it is in the area where most of our wells are, but, you know, Calvin touched a little bit on those Texas Commission of Environmental Quality monitors. We don't know how accurate they are. We don't know. You know, it depends on the wind direction. I mean, if they're letting a bunch of stuff out and the wind's blowing the opposite way from the monitor, you're not going to get any readings. So the town does do their own monitoring with a private company, Kleinfelder. They will increase the frequency of post-drilling fresh water testing. There will be pre-drilling and post-drilling soil samples by a third party, not by the gas company. And if a driller must vent or flare, they have to give a 72-hour notice and contact all living within 1,000 feet. We do have an emission compliance plan in place. If a company receives 2 notices or violations in 6 months from the TCEQ or EPA, the town will implement a compliance plan that includes 24-hour monitoring, reporting to the council, and installation of the appropriate equipment to meet compliance. Now, this was the most controversial of all issues. As a board, we had to look at state and federal mandates and legal issues. Now, we didn't all agree on this, and this was one of those discussions that lasted a long time. But it ended up, in the end, that the majority of the board did want to go in this direction. We did require green completions. We have now added low-frequency noise requirements because they found that low-frequency noise can cause some health issues. It's that low kind of humming, and it can actually cause heart conditions and problems with hearing. So we did add that. We did change our daytime hours, unless they're drilling, of course, which they'd have to drill 24 hours. But if they're fracking, they can only, it used to be 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., and now it's 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then the next thing is, since the Texas Railroad Commission considers pipelines carrying wastewater or brine subject to eminent domain, when looking at the centralized facilities and pipeline ordinance, we did have to consider possible legal limitations. Centralized facilities will continue to be what we call a special use permit. It will also require a zoning amendment. So what this will do is give an extra layer of permitting, an extra process that they have to go through to put in a centralized collection facility or a centralized compression facility. We now require all electric compressors, so no more natural gas compressors, which is huge because if you've ever stood next to a natural gas compressor, it doesn't smell really good. And one day we did tour a site. I was so sick the next day, I could barely get out of bed. It was that bad. I've never experienced anything. Even my bones ached. I couldn't breathe, and it was pretty bad. So that's good. They did put in some strong wording, and I think a lot of people missed this when we were presenting this at the town. But they added the wording, an operator shall eliminate, capture, or destroy any and all emissions emanating from any tanks. And that was added to the tank battery facilities requirements. And I don't know if you know much about tank batteries, but a lot of stuff comes out of them. And they can be really smelly, and it's the kind of stuff that you can't see by the naked eye, but it's there. In the pipeline ordinance, the specifications for centralized facilities and associated pipelines were retained to ensure standards are in place in case the town is sued over a decision not to permit. We've added tracing or tagging of additives to the frac fluid, so that way they can't say we didn't do it. Drillers have to give a 3 business day notice of fracking by posting large signs at the site, near the site. Plus they have to let the town know 10 business days their exact fracking schedule. And now Flower Mound does put that fracking schedule on the website. So, now people can go in and see if something's going to be happening near them. They just don't see everything show up. Flower Mound has always used the closed loop system, and we do not allow reserve pits. So that really helps a lot with contamination. And the town may issue a stop work order in event of any serious health threat at any time, and that is at the discretion of the town. And these are just a few things, but if you want to read more, you can go to the Flower Mound, it's flower-mound.com, and go to the oil and gas section. There's so many forms you can download. It shows all the variances that were approved, variances that were denied, administrative approvals. You can see the process. You can see some of the variants that were denied and some of them that were approved, and see that they were down to 0 feet, in floodplain. So anyways, there's a lot of information. Even some of the studies that we used a property value study that's available online, which showed a decrease of 1 to 14% of home value living near gas drilling sites, which I think is pretty significant, especially when you're in an urban area and you have thousands of homes that could be within 1,500 feet. There's a lot of really good information there that we used. I just want to say I'm pleased with the outcome of the recommendations. And even though I said before there were some things, I can be pretty passionate and I didn't get my way all the time, But you know what? That's what it's all about when you're on a board like that. You know, not everyone is going to get their way, and everybody has to try to work together. And I know I see some people out there that probably were at some of those meetings when I got a little passionate. But I just want to say, you know, I believe we did the best we could to regulate gas drilling in our town. Unless things change on the federal and state level, you know, this is really the best I think that we could do. You know, it's very difficult when you don't have any help from the state and federal level. And each town has to, you know, try to do their best and have to worry about getting sued when they try to protect their citizens. So I'm very pleased. You know, I have to say one thing, having the right people on our town council really helped. You know, none of this would have really probably even got this far if we didn't